Hi, welcome to Dice Control Dojo. I'm Phil, and I'm practicing daily and sharing my tips so we can all do better at the craps table. Today, we're going to talk about the different colored dice and tracking. We're going to talk about how we practice, why we do what we do, and what do we use in order to track our throws. So let's start off. First, we talked about dice a few videos ago about purchasing dice. Check out that video. It's how to get started if you want to start control throwing practice. We buy packs of dice. They come in 5 packs. We want you to buy real dice, not the Yahtzee dice. And these will be numbered. I record the numbers on them, so I make sure that I'm matching them up with the same dice as I'm working along. I have a bunch of dice that are brand new, and I keep moving them through. Once they start chipping in that, I use these dice for practice for my starting to sharpshooting, my dead cats, my just warm-ups. I use these, but once I am really throwing, I grab I have a new set of dice. And you just want to make sure that the edges are still sharp and they're doing well. You don't need to go crazy purchasing a ton of them. I do, but you don't need to. I asked for them for Christmas as a stocking stuffer. They're not too expensive, but I try and get through a pack or two every 6 months because I throw thousands of throws. And I want to make sure that at a casino, they pull a new dice out every hour or 2 hours. So they're crisp, they're sharp, and they're going to stick a lot. So you want to practice with those kind of dice. That's why we use new dice. I use 2 different color. That way I can keep track. So I can see what kind of my left throw and my right throw are. So when I'm practicing throwing and I throw down here, right? So I can see what my left dice are doing and my right dice are doing. And then that way I can see if they're flipping, if they're all over the place, or what I need to do to fix each one of those dice. So it's important to have 2 different types of dice, colors. I do red and green. There are blue, there are yellow, there are all kinds of dice. It doesn't matter. Just make sure you have 2 different ones when you're practicing. Now, why do we practice like this? I want to ensure that when I'm throwing the dice, I can track both types of dice. Now, when you're in the casino, remember, those dice are going to be the same color, so it's going to be harder for you to focus on switching. And we'll talk about those on later videos on how you practice to make sure you're paying attention on which dice are doing what. I'm fortunate enough that when I play, I have a teammate at the end that can see what's going on with the dice and he can let me know how that's working. Good feedback. Once again, mentoring and feedback is important in whatever we're doing, right? So I use 2 different color dice. Now, what do I use to track it? You do not need to go crazy on anything. You can have a plain piece of paper and you can just track down what your your left dice is doing and your right dice are doing and write down those numbers. That's all you need to do on a plain piece of paper. That way, you can look back at it and see if your dice are doing what you want them to do. And I like to throw the one way I set this up is called the hard way set. And I set this up the same way each time with the 3s at the top, the 5s, the 4s, and the 2s. And why do I do that? I set it up the same way because the dice on the one side have the 1s, and the dice on the other side have the 6s. So I use the hard way set. So when I'm throwing these dice down the row and I'm going to keep track of them like this, I threw that down and that was a hard 4, a 2 and a 2. So I knew that these 2 landed on axis. They landed in the same rotation that I threw it. But if this was a 1, then I knew that the right dice was off. It spun off of axis. So We're talking about that in the future on what that looks like when you're manipulating the dice. But I like to set them the hard way. So when I'm practicing my dice throw, I can instantly see how I'm throwing. So I can throw these down, and just by looking at how these landed, this was a 1 and a 5. That's a 1 and a 5. So I know that this green dice, my left one, was not thrown on axis. It did not rotate around. It spun off one. The other one was on axis. So I had one on axis and one off of axis. What is axis? So when you're taking a dice and I'm setting it with the hard way set like this is the hard way set. I have my 3s, my 5s, my 4s, and my 2s. If they spin and land in any one of these ways, I know it's on axis. If a 1 shows up or a 6 shows up, that means they spun on the way and they're off axis. So we want to make sure we're throwing on axis. That'll get us the best results, and we'll talk about that in future videos. So we have the 2 different colored dice. The Y is because we want to make sure we're throwing consistently and properly each. How are we doing this? Pieces of paper. You can write it down and keep track of it. I can keep track of it all day. But what I have is the Mad Professor and Stanford Wong has a thing called Bone Tracker. You can get it online under the Mad Professor's website. I still think it's available. If it's not, can somebody please give me some feedback on that? I think I looked it up and I was able to download it again. But there's other tracking methods online that you can purchase or you can have, and I recommend that highly. I'm putting in the video now on what this looks like when you're tracking something. So you can put the 2 and the 4 in, and it'll give you the results right there. I'll also show you my first 360 views. I'm posting that right up right now, and what that looks like. I have a 6.32 SRR, which we talked about before, 7s to roll ratio, and I'm trying to improve that. I want to be up in the 7s, 8s, 9s. So I keep track of it on this Bone Tracker, which the Mad Professor is gracious enough to have posted in his website, and I suggest you download that. It makes it easier for you to look at the different ways of throwing. It's also a fantastic way of seeing if you're throwing the right way, meaning I'm setting the hard way. Is that the best way for me to throw on the big way I throw, or do I have to throw in a different way? Do I have to throw with a different set in order for us to be successful? And the Bone Tracker will do that. But there are other websites that have tracking apps that you can do, and I highly suggest you take a look at them. Also, when you're at the table, there's a lot of people have a lot of different ways that they track at the table. I put six chips across the front, and as soon as I throw something, if it's on axis, I use a red chip to put it on there. So I have a 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10. So if I threw a 9 on axis, I put a red chip down. If it's a 9 off of axis, I put a dollar chip down. That way at the end, when I'm looking, I can say, oh, I threw 15 times. I threw on axis 6, and I threw 3 9s. If I throw any craps, not throw a 7, because once the 7's up, it's done, unless you have a come out in the middle. I put a chip down for the 2, 3 is going to be in the singles, and the 11 and 12 are going to be in the reds. So that's how I keep track of it, using chips. There's 100 ways of keeping tracks of it. Lots of people posting videos. You can check your videos. Tell me how you track your chips when you're on the table. I'd like to see what better way there is for you to track. The last thing is there's a charting thing you can purchase by the Craps Coach, and he has a lovely sheets that you can purchase and bring to the, and I keep track on that using a pen and pencil. They don't mind you doing that. They actually, a lot of the dealers are like, are you keeping track? And I'm like, yeah, I like to look. I keep track because I like to keep track of all of my buddies. So all four of us, I keep track of how we threw. So when we sit after a session, we go sit down and have some coffee. We go over who threw what, make fun of each other, talk about what those throws look like. It's a good discussion tool. Also, too, when I come back, I'll post that on our feed with each other, so we can always have record of what it is. I keep track of every throw that we do when we practice every Sunday, and I keep track of everything we throw when we are at the casinos. I'm on my third book right now, and this is our our throws that we practice every Sunday. I keep track of how many throws we do, how many points we hit, how many times we throw, and how much money we make each Sunday. So it's a little fun to kind of go back and look, but it's also good for us to keep track so we can see if we're not doing something right. If we're having some bad throws, we should be able to see it, talk about it. Once again, mentoring, using this information. Is there information we can use to get better? That's something we want to use all the time. It doesn't matter if you're using a computer, it doesn't matter if you're just using a piece of paper to keep track. What you need to do is make sure you're tracking it, because you can mentor yourself by looking at these numbers on that piece of paper and say, oh, I'm throwing a lot off axis on the left-hand side or the right-hand side. And in future videos, I'm going to tell you how I was taught from some great coaches on how to get better at doing that. So let's sum up today. Practice using different colored dice, why that's important, what tools we use, whether it's a computer, a piece of paper, or just some chips, on how to keep track of what you're doing. It's important to do that for your own sake, to self-mentor. So remember, the best betting strategy is to throw for a long time. Join us tomorrow when we're going to talk about the book that made me start this whole thing, Talent is Overrated. We're going to discuss why it's important, what we learned, and how I applied that to dice control.